So I wonder if people are let in. Hard to see. But,
I think we should start, no?
okay. Let me start. Okay, it's 3:45 Eastern Time. If you're joining us from the US, otherwise it's in the evening here in Europe, where I'm in my office. I'm Torsten Persson, I'm chairing the session, which is hosted by the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics. We have 3 papers, no discussants, and we have agreed to devote about 30 minutes to each presentation, followed by questions from the audience. And the first paper will be presented by Stephanie Stancheva. Actually, Stephanie should be congratulated. She just received the Elaine Bennett Prize, literally just now, like half an hour ago. And that's a great honor, and we're happy to have her present the first paper. Please, Stephanie.
Great, thank you so much for putting the paper on the program. Very delighted to be here. So this project is joined with Armando Miano, who's in the audience, and our wonderful colleague and co-author Alberto Alesina, who very, very sadly passed away this year, and who we miss very, very much. And I can basically hear Alberto telling me right now what he always says, which is, don't screw up. So I'll try not to screw up. So this project tries to draw the link between views on immigration and support for redistribution. Immigration was in the debate in many recent elections, both in Europe and in the US. And many arguments centered not just around cultural issues or backlash against immigrants, etc., but also about what will happen to public finances, whether immigrants actually contribute to the public finance pool or not. And so in this project, what we were interested in is 2 broad questions. First, what do people know about immigration and immigrants? Do they have misperceptions or are they accurate? And we're interested in detailed perception, so about the number of immigrants, about their origins, their religion, their unemployment, their education, poverty, etc. And then we want to relate this to their views on immigration policies and also see how it differs for different people by political affiliation, by whether you work in a high migration sector, income, education levels, etc. The second big question is, what is the link between immigration perceptions and redistribution views? So there are many theories that have been written, including by people here in the audience, that generosity doesn't travel that well across national, ethnic, or religious lines, and that people support more redistribution if it's going to benefit others who are more like them, more similar to them. So in this project, we're going to run large-scale surveys. And before I go into those details, I wanted to just give you a 30-second pitch on this major methods that we're going to be using here. In particular, I think this is something that can teach us a lot about what people think and how they reason. And perhaps the immigration issue is one of the best suited to these methods. So what we're using is large-scale socioeconomics surveys and experiments. And we call this social economics because it's about how people reason, think, and form views about economic policies and issues, but based on views and considerations linked to society and social phenomena. And clearly, a lot of our work as economists focuses on the very important questions about what policies actually do or what they should be like. But here's a third angle, which is to look at them based on how people perceive them and what their mental models are about them. So in a sense, it's a bit of an invitation to get into people's minds and listen to them. And I'm not saying this in an idealistic, wishful way, but rather as a rigorous research tool using surveys. And surveys are a key tool, although as economists, we prefer typically to use reveal preference approaches. But surveys can really get at those invisible things in other data, like perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, and views. And we may have some intrinsic mistrust against surveys as economists, especially when we think of electoral polls or the old style surveys, which were used to elicit things that today are much better seen in admin data. And in principle, on many things, you can write, fully structural parametric models and then use observational data to back out the intangibles, the unobservables. But you're really hitting the limits when it comes to people's attitudes, knowledge views on policies and some economic issues. First, you don't really see that variation in the data. We're not often asked to vote on separate issues, so that observational data is missing. And second, many of those views actually depend on higher order beliefs, what you think others will do or how others are, which you will really almost never reveal with your own behavior. And so surveys are a more direct way of eliciting these intangibles. And of course, for them to be reliable, it's critical that they're well designed, carefully calibrated, and deployed on appropriate samples. So there's a lot of work that goes into the design of these surveys and to ensure high quality answers. And I'll illustrate this here in detail with many questions. And I can talk more in the Q&A, of course. They can be made interactive, customized. We can show different information sets to different people. And so I think it's an incredibly valuable tool. So now that I've said this, this particular survey is run in 6 countries: France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And it has the following structure on more than 22,500 respondents. So first, we ask people about their socioeconomic and demographic information. In particular, in addition to standard things like age, income, education, gender, etc., we ask them whether they have an immigrant parent, which job sector they work in, so that we can classify them based on whether their job sector is immigrant intensive or not, and their political views in great detail. Then people will be randomly led into one of 4 branches. The first branch sees information on the actual number of immigrants in their country. The second on the origins of those immigrants in their countries, where they come from. The third will get an anecdote treatment, which will emphasize, a story in the day of a life, in a day of the life of a very, very hardworking immigrant. So it's going to be a narrative, not a factual-based treatment. And then the 4th branch is the control group that sees nothing. Then we have an immigration block, the order of which will actually also be randomized. So here we elicit detailed perceptions about not only the number of immigrants, but also the detailed characteristics of immigrants, their origins, how hard they work according to people, their unemployment rates, their poverty, education level, reliance on government transfers, etc. And then support on immigration policies. And here I want to make clear that on immigration policies, we are intentionally trying to be quite detailed. So we of course have questions such as, do you support more or less immigration? But also more nuanced questions that can give you a more complete picture, such as, how long after they arrive should immigrants be allowed to vote, for instance, or apply for citizenship, or be eligible for benefits? And we also ask, when would you consider an immigrant to be truly part of the country? Soon, or only once they get citizenship, or only their kids, or never, etc. And then we have this redistribution block where we ask people about their views on the income taxes, on how to allocate a given budget to various categories of spending. And we even have a donation question, which is asking people whether they want to donate some of their earned money to one of several charities. So to give a bit more background here, the way this is done is to allow people to play with pretty large amounts of money. So we tell them that when they enter the survey, they're actually enrolled automatically to be part of a lottery to win $1,000 or equivalent. But before they know whether they've won, they have to commit how much, if anything at all, to donate to one of 2 charities. And we pick the charities to be very well known for each country. And importantly, they're charities that are not geared towards immigrants at all. They're charities that are geared towards low incomes or poor people in general, because our interest is in figuring out whether the issue of immigration basically has impacts on redistribution as a whole. And so after that, we ask people about their detailed views on the role of government, such as, do they actually think inequality is a problem and the government should do something about it? Is the government able to do things to reduce inequality, etc.? So these 2 blocks, immigration and redistribution, will be randomized. Some people will see one of them first and the others will see the other one first. One thing to note is our definition of immigrants. So we're going to repeat it multiple times throughout the survey to people, and our definition is foreign born, someone who's not born in the country. So the reason we do this is to avoid issues related to very different rules for citizenship and naturalization across countries. In some countries, it's easier than others to become a citizen. So foreign born is very much in line with some OECD stats, And so we always define it. And for the US, we also make sure that to emphasize that we ask about legal immigrants only. But on both these issues, we can always check whether people would be accurate, for instance, if we had included all immigrants, also illegal ones, or whether, people have different views. So whether if we include second generation immigrants, things would change. So we can check these things, but we're trying to be clear on what we mean by an immigrant. So to sum up on the survey structure, we will have these 3 types of randomized experimental treatments. First type, which will turn out to be the most powerful actually, will be this priming treatment, just changing the order in which you see the blocks. And in this case, respondents in the control group who don't see a video won't be given any additional information. They would just be asked questions in a different order. So those who see the redistribution block first will never have heard the word immigrant in the survey until then. So they will not be primed about this. And the second type of treatment we'll have is information, either on the number of immigrants or their shares or their origins. And then the third is a narrative, an anecdote about a hardworking immigrant. Okay. So again, a lot of work goes into the design of these questions to make them intelligible and intuitive to people. And so let me show you some examples. So in particular, when we ask about the number of immigrants, here's how we do it. So we have this slider plus pie chart design. So when respondents land on the page, the pie chart is actually gray. It's starting at gray and the slider is at 0. As soon as they move the slider, the pie chart starts to update. And so in red appears the share that they're entering as foreign born when they move the slider, and the rest becomes blue as here in this case, US born, or for Italy, Italian born. So what's interesting here is that it allows respondents to visualize what they're saying and sort of to do a sanity check. Does this appear like too much or too little? And it's also naturally benchmarked, since whatever is not in red is in blue and vice versa. So you're at the same time eliciting what their view is on who's not an immigrant. So you always want to benchmark things in this way. To elicit the origins of immigrants, we have a very similar design, but it's a little bit more complicated since we now have to ask for each of the 9 regions here, how many immigrants out of 100 come from there. But the idea is the same. Respondents move the sliders to indicate from each region how many immigrants they think come, and the pie chart adapts in real time. What's not shown here is that on top of the screen of respondents, they actually see a world map, and the different regions are in exactly these colors. So to avoid issues about which country lies in which region. Okay. And then another benchmarking we do, so this is pure text, but let me tell you what I'm trying to show you here, is that when we ask about the characteristics of immigrants, for instance, how many immigrants are unemployed, we always also ask about the same characteristics for natives, non-immigrants. So for instance, out of 100 Italian-born people, how many are unemployed? This is very important to benchmark, because if you see, for instance, people overestimate the unemployment of immigrants, you may not be able to deduce that much if people in general overestimate unemployment. And I've picked that example because that's exactly the case. So people tend to inflate unemployment even for non-immigrants. And so what really matters is the gap between their misperception on immigrants and their misperception on natives. Are they systematically more wrong about immigrants? Are they systematically wrong in a given direction about immigrants? Okay, so this is a few examples on how we elicit these sort of perceptions. So what are some key results? We have a lot of descriptive facts in the paper about the perceptions of immigrants on all these demographic and economic dimensions. Let me show you a select few in the interest of time. So let's start with the perceived and actual number of immigrants in a country. So on this graph, each row is one of the countries in the sample, and the x-axis represents the share of immigrants that's actually in the country, that's the blue diamonds, or the average perception of people in that country, that's the red square. And there's some confidence intervals around the red square, which are actually very tight. So you can see that in all countries, respondents very starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. And the US actually takes the cake here. In the US, people think that around 37% of people are immigrants. So this narrative that the US is a country of immigrants clearly is borne out in people's minds. In fact, they're only 10% foreign-born people, 14% if you included estimates of illegal immigrants as well. In Sweden, the country where there are actually the most immigrants currently, is also the country where people are most accurate. So you may wonder what happens if we added second generation immigrants, because although we define it as foreign born and we make it clear, people may just be conflating the two. Of course, it will close the gap a bit, but by no means to the full extent. The gaps would still be very large. You would have to go to third or fourth generation immigrants to close the gap. And at that point, you may start wondering if people still truly consider third and fourth generation immigrants as being immigrants. That might also tell us something about their attitudes. Okay, so another thing we can do is to split it by different groups. So you may ask which groups are more accurate, if at all. We can see this on the next graph, which is a bit harder to read. So now I've pulled all countries together, but we split respondents into different groups, which are shown in each groups of rows here. So for instance, in the bottom two rows, you can see the split by a right wing and left wing, as defined suitably for each country. At the top, it indicates people in three groups: those working in an immigration-intensive sector, those working and that have a college degree, those working in a high immigration sector without a college degree, etc. So split into high-skilled, low-skilled jobs and high immigration-intensive sectors. The x-axis directly shows you the misperception, so the gap relative to reality in your own country on the share of immigrants. So the first thing you can see is that, without exception, all groups overestimate the share of immigrants, even college educated, even higher income people, etc. In fact, the minimum misperception is 15 percentage points. So no group is accurate. And second, you can see that actually, I don't know what your prior was, but if you look at the bottom rows, left and right wing respondents equally overinflate the share of immigrants. There is no gap there. In fact, what we will see is that just the perceived share of immigrants has no effect on your views, really. What really matters is your perceived composition of immigrants. And that's where the right and left wing people will have quite different views about the composition of immigrants. So let me switch to those characteristics. So for instance, here we can see the share of Muslim immigrants in each country and what people think that share is. So I've picked this statistic because none of these countries is a Muslim majority country. And so this is an interesting stats to look at. I think it would be very different and could be very interesting to look at Muslim majority countries and immigrants there. So that's to be done. So in these countries, people inflate the share of Muslim immigrants consistently. So for instance, in the US, people think a quarter of immigrants are Muslim. In fact, it's 10%. France is actually an interesting exception here. In France, 50% of immigrants roughly are Muslim, and that's actually the perception. And so France has a very different, colonial history and explaining some patterns of migration today. In the right panel, we have again this heterogeneity graph that we saw. And I would just like you to focus on the bottom two rows, where you can now see that there's a gap appearing between the perceptions or the misperception of left and right wing respondents, with right wing respondents overestimating the share of Muslim immigrants by more than left wing respondents. So, as I alluded to, I won't really show you all the detailed questions about poverty, education, etc. But across the board, people have quite different views about immigrants and natives, and in particular, they tend to always be more negative about immigrants, even though as a level statement, they also have misperceptions about non-immigrants. But one interesting thing I wanted to show here is the extent to which respondents perceive immigrants as relying on government transfers. So on this graph, you see the share of respondents who think that the average immigrant receives at least twice the transfer amount from governments as the average non-immigrant. So to construct this, it's actually quite a bit of work, because you need to take into account the various transfers in each country. For instance, in the US, it would be welfare payments, food stamps converted to cash equivalents, etc. So quite a bit of transfers that get added up. And of course, we define them for respondents for each country to say what we mean. But in no country is this actually the case. So in no countries does the average immigrant get twice the amount of transfers. So this is a measure of bias already. And you can see that Germany is pretty good here. Very few people think so in Germany, but in other countries like France, and then to a lesser extent, Sweden or Italy, people tend to think immigrants get more transfers. And if you focus on the right graph here, again on the very bottom rows, you see a quite big gap between left and right-wing respondents. So right-wing respondents just think that immigrants get many more transfers than the average non-immigrant. And we also asked people a question that's targeted directly at seeing whether they have some bias about immigrants. So here we tell respondents about two kind of identical men, same age, same income, same family situation, living in the same place. That's how they're described, except one is an immigrant and the other is not. And then we asked them, in your view, does the non-immigrant, who's called, for instance, John in the US, and the immigrant, who's called Mohammed, pay the same amount of taxes or less taxes or more? And does the non-immigrant get more transfers, same transfers, less transfers than the immigrant? And on this figure, we see the share of respondents who say that, yes, Mohammed gets more transfers and pays less taxes than John. And recall that based on the description we did, there's no reason to say so. And actually, Sweden here takes the prize. In Sweden, 0% of respondents say that that's the case, which, given the information, is the only accurate answer here. And in fact, you may wonder what happens if we change the name. So we did randomize the name a bit in a smaller sample. So for instance, in the US, between Mohammed, Felipe, and then something like Jack, a Canadian sounding name, for instance. And as soon as you say the word immigrant, there is an effect, but the strongest effect is on Mohammed. Okay. And again, if you look at the right figure at the bottom row, left and right wing respondents, very big gap there on that sort of bias question. Okay. So to sum up the part of on the perception, there's quite some stark misperception on the various characteristics of immigrants. And although there's no difference between left and right wing respondents on the perceived share of immigrants, there's quite a bit of a gap on the perceived composition and the reliance on government transfers. So you may wonder whether people are actually answering this carefully. And so one thing you can do is to offer monetary incentives for accurate responses. You can do this for questions that have a reality counterpart. You know, it's possible to verify what the unemployment rate is of immigrants, etc. And so we did that. We asked people, we told people that they can get a randomized amount, $5, $10, $20, all the way to $30 for accurate responses. And what we can see is that these financial incentives don't reduce the misperceptions. These statistics are actually quite hard to find. You can probably Google the share of immigrants, but it's actually very tough to find out the unemployment rate of immigrants, etc. A lot of work we did to construct them, so people cannot easily have checked it. And so this suggests that people are already answering sort of to the best of their knowledge. Another interesting thing you can ask is whether people are actually willing to learn more. And so we measure people's willingness to pay for accurate information on immigrants by doing the following. We tell them again that they're enrolled in this lottery that I told you about for the donation question. And now they can forfeit a randomized prize. We tell them, you know, again, $5, $10, you can pay up to $30 to actually get the accurate information. You'll see the actual answers to these questions. And what turns out to be the case, which you can see in this table, where in the first column we regress your willingness to pay. Are you willing to pay that amount conditional on the price that we give, on your various characteristics, and in the first row on a misperception index that measures how wrong you are. What we can see is that those who are more wrong are actually least willing to pay. So those who know least are also less interested in learning more, which is perhaps why they know less in the first place. So this can explain the sort of feedback loop whereby those who are less accurate also seek out less accurate information. Okay. So turning to the experimental variation, remember that we have various types of treatments here. So first, we have the information treatments that tell people the number of immigrants or their origins. So let me show you some screenshots here. So remember, first, we tell people about the share of immigrants in their country. And it's actually a video, but these are just static screenshots. And then we also benchmark it against some other OECD countries to show that, you know, your country is somewhere in between. It's not at either of the extremes. The origins treatment shows people where immigrants come from. So for instance, for the US, it shows in different colors the share of immigrants from different regions of the world. And the number of little stick figures will be proportional to the share of immigrants from that region. And so this will happen for each region one by one, and then a final screen after this is all done will summarize on the screen the composition of immigrants. The anecdote treatment simply tells people a narrative. It's a day in the life, of a very hardworking immigrant that works 2 jobs, takes care of her family, helps her kids, and then, after having done all this, really just dreams of starting a small business one day, etc. So this is really intended to cater to that hardworking immigrant rhetoric. It's an anecdote. It's not factual. It's really based more on emotions and narratives than facts. So what do we find? Oh, and remember, of course, the order treatment where we invert the order between the redistribution block and the immigration block. So what do we find? Well, what we find is that just making people think about immigrants, randomizing the order between the redistribution and the immigration block has quite strong effects. So just making people think about immigrants makes them less supportive of redistribution, even in terms of real donations out of their pocket to charities that support low incomes or poor people. So there's a backlash against redistribution once you're just primed to think about immigrants. What can explain this? Well, given the kind of negative views people have of immigrants that we just saw, it makes sense that just priming them to think about immigration may make them think that immigrants will benefit from redistribution, that they're more reliant on these government transfers, and makes them less prone to redistribution. On the other hand, just providing the factual information on the share and origins of immigrants has no effect. So people adjust their actual views on the share of immigrants. They also adjust their views on where immigrants come from, but it has no effect on their policy preferences. So this suggests that the negative and substantial sort of baseline perceptions of immigrants are not moved by just one piece of info at a time. Given the wide range of misperceptions people have, just telling you something about the share or just telling you something about the origin is not enough. So perhaps having a very comprehensive treatment where you would tell about every single dimension of immigrants, their unemployment, their reliance on transfers, etc., maybe that would work. But just piecemeal info is not enough. And in fact, there's something else going on. Sometimes these treatments, if anything, have a slightly negative effect on preferences for redistribution. Because as we saw, just priming people to think about immigrants has a negative effect. And unavoidably, when you tell people about the share of immigrants, you are priming them to think about immigrants. So there's an inbuilt prime already in those treatments too. The anecdote treatment works a bit better. So having this, kind of extreme scenario of a very hardworking immigrant that caters to this hard work rhetoric can generate some support for redistribution. But even that gets canceled out if people are also if they're also in that branch where they're first prompted to think about the characteristics of immigrants before answering redistribution question. So the prime effect sort of cancels out the effect of that narrative treatment. So what we're left with really is that on immigration, and perhaps many of you who've worked on this have this intuition and have shown it in different settings, on immigration, a lot is driven by narratives and rhetorics, and pure factual information is not something that has a lot of effect. And to be clear, our goal here was not at all to generate support for immigration or try to move people's views on that. It was really to try to elicit what they think, to understand better how they reason about this and what the link will be between immigration and redistribution policies. And the major finding from this order treatment, that just priming people to think about immigrants generates a backlash for redistribution, is perhaps saying something about the current situation where there's a lot of discussion about immigration, and some parties that may be anti-redistribution could actually be using that card to, get less support for redistribution. So thank you so much for your time. I'm very much looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. Very nice. Let's see how to organize this. Maybe if you have a question, you can say so on the chat, and I'll give the word to people. In the meanwhile, while you're thinking, maybe I can ask a question. So when you had these interesting observations about how the perceptions and views differed by left and right wing respondents in the survey. I take it you used left and right in the traditional class-based sense, and maybe immigration involves left and right wing on another dimension that we sometimes call that Galtan or something else. You didn't think about trying to elicit views, on an orthogonal dimension that has to do with authority versus individualism and all of that.
No, so that's an excellent question. And we actually try to be quite detailed about how we elicit political views. So one thing that we do is simply ask which party you voted for in the last election. And there's detailed parties. Some countries have many more than others. And then we classify those parties by left and right along the more economic spectrum. But we could classify the parties by openness, closeness, etc. In which case, I think the results would be even stronger because, as you say, it's almost like by definition, by construction, an anti-immigrant, anti-openness versus pro dimension. But we have the detailed information in terms of the parties people support or plan to support. We also elicit their views on economic policy issues from very conservative, moderate, all the way to very liberal. I'm saying this in the US sense. In European terms would be more from far right all the way to far left in terms of economic policy issues, or like fiscally conservative versus liberal. And so we can also use that question instead. And that split works as well. And then in addition, some countries have, voting for parties, other have voting for people. So in the US, we can ask about Republican, Democrat, and also who you voted for, say Trump, Clinton, or Obama, and at that time was Obama, and etc. So we can do a lot of different splits here. I think that general pattern is going to persist and would get even stronger if we use your definition. So I think that's a very good suggestion.
Other questions?
I see Nicola has a hand raised.
Okay, please, Nicola.
Hi, thank you. Hello. I enjoy very much the talk. I think it's very interesting, really, to ask people really what they think. This is a very interesting avenue. There are two things I didn't fully understand. You have also an estimate of the legal immigrants in your country?
Nicola, sorry, you're very muffled right now. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah,
can you
perfect.
hear me now?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, much better. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. You have estimates of illegal immigrants in each country and how these mistakes are related. Did you try to?
Yeah. So that's a big issue for the US. Or I mean, when I say a big issue, it's around 3 to 4%. And so actually,
okay.
Yeah. And so we actually did a ton of work. I should say Armando did a ton of work on getting the full stats about illegal immigrants too, which, to be fair, are less precise than the ones on legal immigrants because there is just a bit less data since they're not documented. But in the appendix, we basically compare if we added those, if people conflate the two, what will happen? And the gaps are basically still there completely. For Europe, it's actually a very, very small share that's illegal immigrants. It's just much harder to enter Europe illegally. And so for Europe, for most countries, it's below, 0.5% or like 1%. So it's very, very small. So it really makes no difference there.
I thought it was tough in the US because you can get.
From some sides, it's hard to enter the US, but from some sides, it's very easy. Yes.
Okay.
Or easy. I shouldn't say very easy.
No, in terms also of punishments, but anyway, okay, great. So if there are other questions, I have a question, but we have
some more questions, Nicola, from the audience, so let them be posed. So one anonymous attendee asks here, any concerns about selection bias in your survey? Very common for higher participation rate on surveys if they live in metro areas, which maybe respondents believe that there are more immigrants than in the nation as a whole.
Yes. So let me tell you a quick thing about how these participants are actually selected. I'm glad you asked because it's a short talk and I couldn't cover that. But so these respondents are selected through commercial survey companies that typically do consumer market research surveys. And they pay respondents to take these surveys. and we contract with them, they either pay in cash for lower income respondents, or they incentivize higher income respondents by giving them credit card points, frequent flyer miles, hotel points, etc. So to incentivize them to participate. And as a result of this, in terms of pure sample that they have, it's actually broadly representative. So they can get, you know, relatively high income people. Of course, you never get very rich people. That's normal, but in broad groups, it's representative. And we actually enforce that representativity along age, gender, income groups, and then regions in each country by imposing quotas in our survey. So that's representative by construction on these dimensions. Now, there are other dimensions like rural, urban, that may not be captured by the regions, or education or employment status, that we can verify ex post whether that was actually turned out to be okay, since we asked people about those, and they turn out to be quite okay. Actually, on average, these people are slightly more educated, I guess because they're online more. And so there's some small discrepancies, but it's pretty good. Another important thing to note is that, of course, these survey companies send a lot of emails, and out of the many emails they send, not everyone will click on every single survey. Some people some days have time, others don't have time. What's very important is that people have no idea about the topic of the survey as they enter the link. And so they first answer all the questions about their income, their age, et cetera, before they even get to the point where they realize, oh, this is an economics survey, or this is about immigration. And so if at that point they decide to drop out, we can check, is there differential attrition? Is there selection based on the topic in who drops out? And we check that this is not the case. But excellent question, thank you.
Here's another question from the chat from Manish Pandey. Would these misperceptions about immigrants be similar in countries like Canada or Australia, countries with immigrant selection policies and not much illegal immigration?
I would be very curious. I can't conjecture without having seen this. I would be very, very interested in expanding the sample. And as you see, this is also a very US, European-centric survey. And I would be very interested in getting, Muslim majority countries, Asian countries, countries like Canada or Australia. So I can't guess, but I can only say very valid question. And I'll be very interested in seeing that.
One of the other questions in the chat is, in fact, about that. If you did this survey in Turkey, I bet you'd find a greater negative perception of Mohammedan Muslim immigrants from the left-wing people compared to right-wingers.
Yeah, I think that could be interesting to do as well. Turkey is a very interesting example also because of the Syrian refugees that came in, and we can see in a very sort of back of the envelope way that countries that receive more refugees recently have different attitudes too. So yeah, I would be very interested in seeing what happens in Turkey on these perceptions.
Okay, I think we're approaching the end of your allotted time. Maybe Guido, you can start preparing for the presentation. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Excellent presentation, very interesting stuff.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I suppose I can go then. So as you see, this is joint work with Fausto Panunzi and Nicola Pavoni, who are here. Thank you, Torsten, for organizing this. And Fausto and Nicola may participate in the discussion at the end. So the paper that we have written is motivated by the rise of populism in many Western democracies, and in particular by a large recent literature that has shown that those who support populist parties and politicians tend to be in adverse economic circumstances or tend to be hit by adverse economic shocks. This is apparent from survey data that correlate support for populism with economic insecurity, and is also apparent from data that look at the success of populist parties in areas and communities that have been hit by adverse shocks due to technology or international trade. Now, this stylized fact, which has been documented extensively, is puzzling because often, not always, but often, these populist politicians promote tax cuts and welfare state retrenchments. This is true, of course, of Trump in the US. It's true of the Northern League in Italy. If you think about Brexit, it wasn't a vote on populism, but it was promoted by populist politicians. And there is evidence that people who supported Brexit were both on the highly conservative side, but also on the disappointed low middle class. So in this paper, we address this question: why do we see this puzzling correlation between economic shocks and support for conservative economic platforms, and in particular economic policy platforms? And the answer that we give is suggested by prospect theory, and in particular by the idea that if you become disappointed because of an adverse and large economic shock, you become to some extent risk-loving. And clearly populist politicians are intrinsically more risky because they are untested, they are anti-establishments, they are inexperienced, but also the platforms that they propose are often very radical and entail bigger risk. And so the idea that we explore is that these disappointed voters tend to favor populist politicians because of this intrinsic risk. And then we study electoral competition between a safe and a risky candidate, intrinsically risky or safe candidate. And we show that in equilibrium, in this theoretical model, it is optimal for the more risky candidate in some circumstances to promote a policy of lower redistribution compared to the equilibrium policy of the safe candidate. And as a result, this populist politician who has announced this platform of lower taxes in equilibrium is supported by this unwieldy coalition of rich voters who vote for this policy and candidate because of the lower taxes, and disappointed voters who, despite the lower taxes, vote for this politician because of its intrinsic riskiness, given that they are disappointed. Before taking you to the theory, let me show you some evidence from survey data from the German socioeconomic panel that indeed this support for populism is correlated with risk-loving. In Germany, populist politicians are not particularly successful, but of course they have risen over time. And a feature of the German socioeconomic panel is that it is very rich. It's a panel and it has questions that go to the heart of the mechanism that we explore in the theoretical part. So in particular, the variables of interest are a dummy variable for whether you lean towards a populist party. We code as 0 those who do not answer this question when asked, together with those that lean towards other political parties. And we code as populist parties that have traditionally been regarded as populist in the existing literature. Then we exploit a question on risk preferences that has been studied extensively in the survey, which takes a measure of 10 if you are fully prepared to take risk, and 0 if you are unwilling to take risks. This measure has been shown in incentivized experiment to correlate with risk-taking behavior. And because as you will see, the analysis also speaks to a non-monotonicity in the relationship between some of these variables and populism, we also code those who are extremely risk-loving, which we define as having a risk preference above 8. A third variable that we use is a measure of economic disappointment, namely a question of how satisfied are you with your household income. It ranges from 0 to 10, and here too we code people who are extremely dissatisfied as those who have a threshold above 7. The results are similar if you take higher thresholds. These are the lowest thresholds for which the results that I'm going to describe remain very robust. And then we measure individual income, and we can measure those who suffered a large income loss that we defined as having a current income which is below 75% of the 3-year moving average of life income. And then there are other covariates, as you can imagine, that are time varying and that we exploit. And the mechanism that we want to explore is indicated here. So the idea is that if you suffer a large income loss, you become dissatisfied with your economic situation. This makes you more risk-loving, and this makes you attracted by the populist politicians. So to explore these mechanisms, we run these types of regressions. Y is the outcome. T is the treatment. We control for a number of individual features, and then we have wave fixed effects and individual fixed effects. Of course, we only estimate correlations, but because we have these individual fixed effects, we can exploit variation over time. So the scope for unobserved heterogeneity in the estimate of beta is reduced. And then we look at the correlations of each of these steps. So we start with the last arrow, where the outcome is supporting a populist. The treatment is being risk-loving or extremely risk-loving. Then we go to the second link, where the outcome is being risk-loving or in a reduced form sense supporting the populist, and the treatment is being dissatisfied with your income. And then we go to the first of these errors, where the outcome is income dissatisfaction, or the later outcomes are risk love and populist support, and the treatment is having suffered a large income loss. And then we estimate by conditional logic, and the results that I'm going to show you, just to summarize, is that becoming very risk loving, so with individual fixed effects, indeed makes you more likely towards to lean towards a populist by 7 percentage points, and becoming very dissatisfied also has a similar effect on the outcome of populism, and about 5 percentage points to become very risk-loving. Large income loss also has the expected positive sign on these outcomes, but the magnitudes tend to be much smaller. So let me show you some of these results. So the first 4 columns are pooled data without individual fixed effects, and the dependent variable is the populist dummy. And as you see, those who are risk-loving tend to be more in favor of populists, controlling for a number of individual characteristics. And the effect is even stronger for the extreme risk lovers. The last 2 columns insert the individual fixed effects. And as you see, becoming extremely risk-loving remains statistically significant, and the parentheses here display the marginal effects, which are close to 7 percentage points. The difference between column 4 and 5 and 6 is actually due to the sample size, not to the inclusion of the individual fixed effects. Then we repeat the same exercise where now the variable of interest is your dissatisfaction with your economic situation. Now, even columns have the individual fixed effects, uneven columns do not. And as you see, when you have these individual fixed effects, this variable being extremely dissatisfied with your economic situation has a large positive effect on support for populists and also on becoming extremely risk-loving. Notice that income dissatisfaction has a positive effect on support for populism when you do not control for the individual fixed effects. But when you do, the effect disappears or even becomes negative. This also is in line with the predictions, this non-monotonic effect of income dissatisfaction, the difference in sign between income dissatisfaction and extreme dissatisfaction is consistent with the theoretical predictions that I'm going to show you in a moment. Adding extreme risk-loving or risk-loving preferences continues to have an effect on support for populism, even when you control for extreme income dissatisfaction, suggesting that maybe there is a direct mechanism, and this is why we don't want to try and use income dissatisfaction as an instrument for risk preferences, because there remains a direct effect of dissatisfaction on the outcome, even when you include the risk preferences. The last column repeats the same exercise for the treatment of having borne a large income loss. Again, the even columns here refer to the fixed effects estimates. And all coefficients, almost all coefficients, have the expected positive sign on all outcomes of interest, but the magnitude, as you see here from the marginal effects, are very small. Maybe we're not measuring the income shocks accurately. So with this motivation in mind, let me turn to the idea that we explore in the theory. So essentially, we assume that voters' preferences over consumption have this shape. So here is the utility of the individual. Here is his consumption level. And this is his reference point. To the right of the reference point, the utility is linear, he's risk neutral. You could have decreasing absolute risk aversion, the results would be the same. If he consumes below his reference point, he suffers a loss, and his utility function becomes now convex. And so formally, this is how we formalize this function. Your preferences for consumption are your consumption level, and then a loss function mu, which is 0 to the right of the reference point, and it becomes instead a loss to the left, and this loss is convex. So assumptions 1 and 2 are standard in prospect theory. We add assumption 3, which is important for our results, which says that this loss function becomes more convex if you get away from the reference point. So as you move away from the reference point, convexity increases. The third derivative has this property. Then we have a continuum of voters with income data with some known distribution in the population. For simplicity, we assume that everybody has the same reference point. This assumption can be relaxed, but for the results to apply, you need to retain the assumption that the difference between the level of income and the reference point remains increasing in income. So if you are richer, you are less disappointed, or less likely to be disappointed if you are above X. These voters with these kinds of preferences then vote over two candidates. For now, we have no taxes. A moderate candidate who is safe and who generates an income theta for everybody. Sorry, an income theta for voter of type theta. So there is, of course, heterogeneity amongst voters. And then a populist candidate who is risky and inefficient, meaning that if he is elected, the income for voter theta is not theta, but it's theta plus a shock eta minus a parameter z that captures the inefficiency of the populist politician. And eta has mean 0, so it's risky. So because z is positive, this goes to the inefficiency of the populist politician. But the support of the shock eta is such that with some probability, the populist can generate a higher income for this voter compared to the moderate. So on average, the populist is inefficient, but there is a chance that he will give you higher income. So the expected utility of these voters ahead of the election are as described in this slide. So if the safe moderate politician is elected, the voter with income theta has a utility of theta plus the loss that I described before. If the risky populist is elected, instead the expected utility of the voter now has to also incorporate the expectation over the loss function. And if you depict these utility functions, they look like this. So in the horizontal axis, we have the income. On the vertical axis, we have the expected utility. For the moderate candidate, you have the black line. So for voters above the reference point, utility is linear, and below it's convex with loss aversion. If you elect the politician, the populist politician, instead, the expected utility function varies with theta, is shown in the red line. It is curved here because there is now an expectation. It's inefficient, so the red line is below the black line. But because it is more risky, you can show that the expected utility under the populist can cross the black line at a point like theta hat. In fact, you can show that these two lines can cross only once, given the assumptions on the shape of mu. And so voters to the left of this crossing point are better off with the populist because he's more risky despite the inefficiency, and voters to the right instead prefer the moderate. And as this picture shows, those who hate the populist the most are the voters close to the reference point because they are risk averse because of the loss aversion triggered by this shape of preferences. And so the next step then is to allow these two candidates to compete in an election on a redistributive linear income tax. So we allow them to commit to a tax. Tau M is the tax announced by the moderate politician. Tau P is the tax announced by the populist politicians. So the consumption of voter type theta under a moderate politician, given the platform that he announced, is his income net of tax plus the transfer. And the transfer is given by it's the linear income tax. So it's the tax rate times average income minus tax distortions that have the usual properties of being convex. If instead you consider the consumption of the same voter under the populist, it's going to reflect the tax announced by the populist, the tax distortion, and then the shocks that I described before. And the important point is that now that you allow these taxes to be chosen, single crossing need not hold. And in particular, if the two politicians announce the same tax rates, of course, you are in the same situations as before. So here you have the black line for the moderate and the dotted line being the expected utility for the populist. Suppose, however, that now the populist politician announces a lower tax rate than the moderate candidate. Then expected utility becomes steeper because it's less sensitive to income with a lower tax rate. And so you can have that the populist, the expected utility under the populist, which is now given by the solid line, solid red line, cuts the moderate, the expected utility under the moderate politician in 2 points. At point theta upper bar and also at point theta lower bar. So as you reduce tax rates, these red expected utilities become steeper, and point theta upper bar moves to the left, and point theta lower bar also moves to the left. With double crossing, the voters who are richer than theta upper bar prefer the populist because of the lower taxes, despite his inefficiency. And the voters to the left are so of theta lower bar are so disappointed that they prefer instead, continue to prefer the populist despite the lower distribution. And the group in between supports the moderate politician. Now, in this situation, so you have really two dimensions of political conflict. You have a dimension of redistribution, which is driven by income, but then a second dimension of conflict is over the intrinsic features of these candidates, which is valued differently by voters. Disappointed voters want risk. They are willing to give up redistribution because of that. The voters close to X are risk averse, and they may want redistribution, and the rich voters don't care about risk. They only care about taxes. Now, because of the double crossing of this line, you may not, you are in a situation in which a Condorcet winner need not exist. And without a Condorcet winner, a Nash equilibrium for an electoral competition model does not exist necessarily. It may exist, but we cannot be sure that it will if double crossing is a feature of the equilibrium. And so to study a game with these features, rather than assuming a simultaneous move by the two politicians, we study sequential moves. In particular, in this example that I'm going to describe, we study a situation in which the incumbent is safe and moves first, and he sets a tax rate. And then the populist politician chooses the tax rate. Voters observe both tax rates and decide how to vote. And both candidates maximize the vote share. It turns out that the order of moves is actually not important for the qualitative results, but this order is perhaps more sensible because you can interpret the safe incumbent as the incumbent who is less flexible in announcing a new policy. Also, notice that if a Nash equilibrium exists, it coincides with the Stackelberg equilibrium. So this is really a device to generate an equilibrium when you don't have necessarily a Condorcet winner. So this is the main result of the theoretical part. Suppose that you have a large enough income shock such that the average voter is below his reference point plus this expression. So this means that a lot of the population is disappointed. Then in this case, you can show that you can, the equilibrium can have one of two features. Either you are in a situation in which the populist politician is left indifferent between setting a tax higher than or equal to that of the moderate, or you are in or setting a tax less than or equal to that of the moderate. So one equilibrium is that in which the populist politician is left indifferent between these two options. The second possibility is instead that the populist politician strictly prefers a lower tax rate than the moderate. So the equilibrium is either has property 1 or has property 2. So this says that you cannot have a situation in which the populist politician strictly prefers to set a higher tax rate than the moderate. Moreover, in this second case, which is the more interesting one, of course, there is double crossing or more, as in the previous figure. So the populist politician is supported by this unwieldy coalition of rich voters and disappointed voters, while the voters in between tend to vote for the moderate politician. To give you the intuition behind this result, let me consider first the equilibrium in which the range of possible tax rates such that the populist tax rate is greater than or equal to, by the populist, is greater than or equal to the tax rate of the moderate. Then we know from the previous pictures that we are in the regime with single crossing here, because if the moderate has a larger tax rate, its curve is steeper than that of the populist. So we have single crossing. And with single crossing, the voters to the left of theta hat prefer the populist, and the voters to the right prefer the moderate. And both of these politicians will want to shift theta hat so as to gain votes. You can show that this means that both want to raise taxes because this flattens their curves and this shifts theta hat in their favor. But doing so entails higher tax distortions, and so they will stop until when the marginal inefficiency of the tax distortions compensates the benefits of shifting theta hat in their favor. So if this constraint does not bind, so if nothing else happens, you're going to have a single crossing equilibrium in which both of these candidates converge to the bliss point of this pivotal voter who is just indifferent between these two options. But this is not necessarily the only equilibrium. It could be that the single crossing equilibrium is entails such a high tax rate that at some point the populist may prefer to cut taxes in order to get the votes of the disappointed voters. And so if we are in this situation, the moderate politician has to choose between stopping short of chasing the populist with higher taxes, and then you are single crossing, but the moderate has lower tax rates than the populist, or accepting a higher tax rate, and in this case, we have the double crossing or more. And you can show that in equilibrium, the populist politician in the second type of equilibrium is going to be left, sorry, in equilibrium is going to be left indifferent between these two options, or you are going to be in a situation in which the populist politician strictly prefers a lower tax rate. And one intuition behind this result is the following. If you think about the consequences of reducing taxes, you can show that the populist politicians has a stronger incentive to reduce taxes, because when taxes are reduced, the poor become more disappointed. And being more disappointed, they are attracted by the intrinsic riskiness of the populist politician. So the electoral penalty of lower taxes amongst the poor voters tends to be higher for the moderate politician than for the populist politicians. And for this reason, you are going to have an equilibrium in which the safe candidate finds it optimal to keep a higher tax rate than the populist politician. So summarizing, disappointed voters here trade off risk preferences versus redistributive policies, while rich voters only care about expected income. If there is a large negative shock, you can have an equilibrium with this unwieldy coalition of disappointed and rich voters. And the forces that push for this are this marginal force that I just described, namely the electoral benefit of higher taxes is larger for the moderate because redistribution reduces disappointment, and also the fact that the rich don't care about risk. They are the inframarginal voters for the moderate, who tends to be supported by the rich because he's more efficient. And so he doesn't care so much about losing them, and the populist politician instead seeks to attract them with lower taxes, knowing that he is not going to lose the most disappointed voters. Let me stop here. There are some extensions, but we don't have time to discuss them.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take some questions. Okay, so while you're thinking, let me use my monopoly as chair to pose a question. I think it's about the data and the theory. So I think these income losses that you talk about are likely to come from job losses. Then not all job losses are alike, because some people lose their job and have a lot of job-specific human capital, or they fall a lot in their income if they hold a job that gives some rent. And those voters face a larger income loss. Arguably, they also have a higher reference point. So they should become more disappointed. So if you looked in the data for the type of jobs that people have and potentially have lost, then you might get that natural conclusion that people who have a good job lose it. They are more likely to vote for a populist, which I think is likely to be true in the data. And in the theory, then with a higher reference points, then of course they would become a different phenomenon to discuss in the equilibrium determination of taxes. So that's something to think about.
Right. So we haven't done that exercise. We could of looking at the former employment. However, let me counter with two observations that may go in the opposite direction relative to the forces that you have described. One is your savings. If you are richer, you are likely to be wealthier, and so that gives you more room to absorb the shock. And the second is the data that, in fact, supports this idea, because, not surprisingly, income dissatisfaction is very highly negatively correlated with current income. About the correlation coefficient is almost 40%. So the people who are more dissatisfied tend to be people with low income. And one rationalization is this wealth story that may do an absorption of your shocks. But you're right that investigating heterogeneity in occupation could be important.
At least in Sweden, we find a very strong effect of people having more risky jobs, being more ardent supporters of the radical right. So, yeah. Anyway, other questions, please. Maybe Nicola or Fausto wants to add something.
I think in my view, you explained very nicely, so don't have any need to add anything. In my view, he explained carefully everything, so I don't have to add anything to what Guido said from my point of view.
Good.
Same for me.
All right. So maybe we go to the third presentation then. You see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I apologize. The paper which I'm presenting is joint with Tim Besley. However, it's not the one described in the abstract, but it's on a very similar theme, and I've uploaded the slides because the underlying paper is under revision. So the points of departure should be well known, particularly to the audience of this session. We have seen a wave of nationalist populist politics sweeping across countries and electoral systems. And we think that you see a growing political conflict that goes beyond the traditional economic dimension. This wave is partly pushed by politicians and parties that are new, often radical right, often populist, and it's partly adopted by existing parties. And an important part of this evolution seems to be that there are some angry people, angry voters out there who identify with the nation, and they protest against many things, but in particular against immigrants and the establishment. So we have a changing political scene where the political values among the voters seem to not only reflect the traditional left to right cleavage, but also this Galtan cleavage, authoritarian individualist cleavage, as many observers among political scientists have told us a couple of decades ago. We also see some new social groupings outside of the political system with growing participation. These groups conspire and express this type of discontent. What I have in mind are groups like Pegida in Germany, Vote Leave in the UK, various alt-right groups in the United States. And then, of course, there is among the voters larger support for new populist politicians and new populist parties. There are also responses in the political system. New parties crop up, shake up the old party systems, and existing parties seem to adapt and change their platforms. Now, there's no shortage of explanations for what happens. Much of that debate goes on in the popular discussion. But even in academia, I would say that certain lack of theory models the academic discussion too, when it comes to what is a cause, what is a mediator, what is an effect. So for example, some people point to globalization as a driver of this development, but globalization has been with us for 25, 30 years. Others point to refugee migration, which is much more recent, at least in its European incarnation, which is supposed to have driven the recent evolution towards the radical right. And when people point to the change of recruitment and change to the structure of existing parties as a driver, is that really a driver, or is it an outcome, an adjustment to a changing reality? The same question can be posed when one speaks about the formation of these new social groups as drivers, the entry of new radical right parties or populist parties, or the drift towards more nationalistic values. Are they drivers or are they equilibrium outcomes? So to put it succinctly, we need theory, we need models to explore these kind of issues, and that's what we try to provide in this paper. So there are three key elements in the model I'm going to try and describe to you. The first one is electoral competition in two political dimensions. One reflects class, the other one will reflect identity and values. Then there is going to be endogenous organization, endogenous political organization. There can be change in the candidate mix of existing parties. There can be formation of new social groups that will take place outside of the political system, and there can be entry of new political parties. These aspects are typically not present in the standard models that we use in political economics. And then finally, there's going to be also endogenous dynamics where values will change and be both a driver and the response to what goes on in the politics system. So our main motivation are these big picture macro trends that I've been talking about. Our analysis has many moving parts. So to get some results without too much untractability, we rely on pretty crude micro foundations and unrealistic symmetries. These can be relaxed in favor of richer foundations and introducing asymmetries, but at the cost of tractability. So clearly what we do is related to much previous work, both in political economics and in social science at large, but I don't have time for a detailed literature review. So let me just tell you the outline for what I hope to do in this talk. So I'll start by describing to you this baseline model that we construct, where left, right, and identity-based policy conflicts are resolved in electoral competition. Then we'll do 3 extensions with endogenous political organizations. And this will enable us to ask whether existing parties change with more salient nationalism, or whether new social groups and new political parties emerge. And we will also be able to ask whether and how such changes will shape immigration policy. Immigration policy will be the policy in the identity domain. And then finally, I'll introduce briefly the dynamics of nationalism and ask how nationalist attitudes and immigration policy might co-evolve. And then we can also ask the perhaps $10,000 question in this situation, namely, if we have a temporary bout of nationalist policies, do they stay with us even when that temporary bout goes away, or the sources of that temporary bout goes away? I don't say Brexit vote and Trump, but you can think about those in the background. So the baseline model is a very simple setting. It's a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 model. So there are going to be two economic groups. People are going to be born either as poor or as rich, and this will give rise to a traditional class-based political cleavage. There are two social identities. So people identify either as nationalists or cosmopolitans, and mu denotes the share of nationalists, which is in between some upper and lower bounds, which can be 0 or 1 if you like, or determined by some historical cultural features. There are going to be two dimensions of government policymaking: an income tax between 0 and 1, which is sort of related to the class-based cleavage. And there's going to be a measure of the openness of immigration policy, also between 0 and 1, and that's going to be related to this identity-related cleavage. Then we will have two traditional parties. They will compete for office. They represent the rich and the poor, one party for the rich, one party for the poor, and they are going to be, at least initially, run by cosmopolitans to reflect the pre-populist radical right equilibrium. They can commit to an immigration policy stance, but not to a tax policy stance, but will level the playing field as the analysis goes on. So people will vote for these parties. Their votes will, as usual, be based on the platforms that they see and some random shocks. And here, for practical purposes, the cosmopolitans will be loyal voters, voting either with the rich or the poor party, and the nationalists will be the swing voters, who will take a stance on the policy that is promised to them. So the two-ness kind of continues. We isolate two key drivers of the equilibrium in this baseline model. One we call, one parameter, Z, we call class polarization. Is basically a measure of inequality. It's the distance between the bliss point of the poor party and the bliss point of the rich party, and or the left and the right party, if you like. And that, of course, is going to reflect the distance in average incomes between the poor and the rich. And when Z is higher, the parties are going to have an incentive to compete harder for the swing voters, because losing means a larger loss to them. The other key parameter we call migration salience, and that is denoted by theta. It's a different theta than the one in the previous paper. Now theta means the weight, the relative weight that nationalists put on immigration issues as opposed to traditional redistributive issues. And if theta is higher, then the parties get a stronger voting response if they try to court the nationalists by giving them a more strict immigration policy. So these parameters, Z and theta, are going to be complementary in politics. So roughly speaking, what matters is the product of them rather than their individual values. So proposition 1 in the paper portrays the equilibrium immigration policy, and it looks in a stylized way like this. The higher is the product of immigration salience and class polarization, the more strict is immigration control. Remember, X equal to 1 is open borders and X equal to 0, basically closed borders. or worse treatment of immigrants more generally. So what's going on here? Well, an immigration policy becomes stricter if salience of immigration to the nationalists is higher or class polarization is greater, subject to this interaction effect. Why is there a proviso in terms of this interaction? Well, in order to pick a stricter migration policy, you must attract enough nationalists, and that requires a certain level of theta. But that's not enough. For cosmopolitan parties to court a nationalist with such a policy, they must worry enough about polarization and losing power to the other party. So that's why the two parameters are complementary to each other. So that's basically the baseline model. Now let me introduce three extensions where political organization might change or be endogenous more generally. So the first one is the composition of existing parties in terms of the candidate mix that they present to the voters. The second one is a change outside of party politics, the formation of nationalist social groups that I mentioned in the introduction. And the third extension takes place inside the political system and is just an entry of a nationalist party. So I would argue that these extensions are of both empirical and theoretical interest. They are of empirical interest because they capture some important aspects that are absent in most standard models. And from a theoretical point of view, it turns out that they all sow the seeds of path dependence in the sense that a temporary shock can permanently shape nationalist sentiment and immigration policy. You will see that in a second. So let me start by the composition of existing parties. As I mentioned, in the baseline model, parties can commit to an immigration policy. That may not be a very attractive assumption. A strict immigration policy may not be credible for a party dominated by cosmopolitans, as we have assumed that they are. That's like a party of the rich promising high taxes, or a party of the poor promising low taxes. So suppose to credibly promise a stricter immigration policy to the voters requires a cosmopolitan-led party to field a larger share of nationalist representatives. And let's, for simplicity, make that 1 minus X, that share. So the stricter your policy, the larger the share of nationalists you have to field to the voters. If so, credible immigration policy comes at a cost. So suppose a cosmopolitan leader has some basic popularity among her own ilk, i.e., if there are just cosmopolitans, she loses power internally as a leader with probability lambda. But that probability of losing power as a leader might increase with more elected nationalists. In particular, the higher the share of nationalist politicians you run, as a cosmopolitan leader, you face a larger challenge, and your probability of losing out is larger. So if that's true, which is true in our model, party leaders are going to face an additional trade-off when they decide on policy. Catering to the nationalist voters raises the risk of party takeover, now by a nationalist. So let sigma be the cosmopolitan leader's benefit of holding on to power. So then we get the second result. An immigration policy of both parties, because the parties will converge to the same policy as long as they're symmetric, is going to be stricter, i.e. more harsh, either if the value of holding on to office of the leaders is lower, that's pretty straightforward, but it's also going to be harsher if the leaders are innately less popular, i.e. if lambda is a higher, has a higher value. So now reductions in immigration control, or rather increases in immigration control, reductions in X, will lead to a greater chance of party takeover. And if we combine the previous proposition and this one, we find that party takeover by nationalists becomes more likely the higher is immigration salience and the higher is class polarization, because this incentivizes the parties to court the nationalists, and to do that credibly, they have to field many nationalist candidates and they can take over the party. So the second extension involves the formation of nationalist social groups. I already gave you the examples of German Pegida, UK Leave Vote, and US alt-right groups. There are others in European countries. And these groups tend to engage their members or the supporters via the social media. They organize rallies, they organize various protests in the streets. And it's plausible to assume that these groups create a collective social identity. That's here we're borrowing insights from the work in sociology on mobilizing social movements that has previously been applied mostly to left-wing movements, but it can equally be applied to right-wing social movements such as these groups. So in the formal model, we assume that forming a group has a fixed, actually sunk per capita cost, which we call F. And because of this collective social identity that is entailed in the group, the effective immigration salience among group members will be higher than when they identify individually as nationalists. So previously, we measured their immigration salience by theta. Now, each group member, because of this collective social identity, will internalize the outcome for other group members. So the more group members there are, the higher is mu, the higher the effective salience for an individual. And psi here is just a measure of this within group altruism. So if this is true, then parties become more motivated to adapt policy to group members' preferences, and more so the larger is the group because of this effect. So then we get that if we let the cost, per capita cost of forming the group go to 0, we can work out a sufficient condition for the group to form on the following form. So that is, nationalist social group will form when the share of nationalists reaches a critical level mu hat. And the cause of forming the group is instrumental. It is to influence the policy outcome. So now we can combine propositions 1 and this recent result and say that given the share of nationalists, a nationalist social group is more likely to form when immigration salience is higher and class polarization is greater. And note now that a group formation implies a stricter immigration policy. Why is that? Because the effective salience among nationalists that is internalized by the parties, it rises from theta to uppercase theta, which is this multiple of the individually held parameter. And note also that with the group in place, if the share of nationalists is higher, then the immigration policy will get stricter. Maybe I should take away these frames. So thirdly, let's consider entry by nationalist political parties. This has a similar macro feature as group formation in the sense that we assume that there is a fixed per capita cost of forming now a party. There would be an instrumental reason to form a party, namely to influence immigration policy. But the channel of policy influence is very different. In the case of a nationalist social group, it's an indirect route via the existing party motives. Here, the channel is instead direct, namely representation in parliament or Congress or whatever the legislative assembly. So one route is that a new party enters and obtains a majority. Then it can do what it wants. So then it shifts policy from what it would have been in its absence, in the absence of entry, down to the bliss point of nationalists, which is the harshest immigration policy. But that's not the only possibility. The other possibility is that a new party enters, and since there are now 3 parties, it can form a coalition with one of the other parties, the poor party or the rich party. And then policy is going to shift from the counterfactual policy with 2 parties to some other numbers. And that number is what the new party can bargain in a coalition government with one of the other parties. And notice that it can obtain a lower, a harsher immigration policy when the redistributive conflict Z between the poor and the rich is a larger number, because then they have more to gain by making a coalition with this new party who can offer something on redistribution that the other party cannot. So when we work through the comparative statistics for entry, we find that entry is most likely when polarization is low, but immigration salience is high. So it's the case where the existing parties basically ignore the nationalists. They, in the policy, they continue to pursue an open policy, immigration policy, but the nationalists are highly motivated by a high immigration salience. But these results also depend on the electoral system. So under plurality rule, a nationalist party only enters when the nationalist share of voters makes up a plurality, with the side condition that such entry shifts policy. So here, only the majority route is open because of the electoral system. One party has to win more or less. Under proportional representation instead, a nationalist party can enter early, i.e. for all possible values of the nationalist share from the lower bound up to 1/3 where it entered under plurality rule, because now the new party can form a majority coalition with one of the existing parties. And essentially, it offers the other party a better tax policy than it would obtain when forming a coalition with its class adversary. And it offers that better tax policy in exchange for a stricter immigration policy. Finally, let me say a few words about the dynamics of nationalism. So here we study how the nationalist share evolves over time. So in the baseline model, you'd enter period S with the nationalist share, dated by that period. then you'd play the political game that we have already studied, and then a next generation of citizens would identify as nationalists or cosmopolitans. This will determine the share of nationalists for the next period. Now, how do we model those dynamics? We assume that it's driven by the expected payoff to holding one or the other identity. So let delta be the difference between the payoff to holding a nationalist identity minus the payoff of holding a cosmopolitan identity. So if you like, delta here is the cultural fitness of holding a nationalist identity, and clearly this will hinge on the equilibrium policy and hence on these parameters theta and z. And then we simply assume a Darwinian dynamic, namely that the nationalist share is increasing if the fitness of holding nationalism is positive, and it shrinks if the opposite is true. And you can derive this kind of dynamics from alternative socialization models, as we have shown elsewhere. So now in the baseline model, we get a simple baseline result, namely from any starting point, we get unique dynamics. The polity converges to maximal nationalism if the fitness of nationalism is positive, and you converge to minimal nationalism if the fitness of nationalism is negative. And as I mentioned, this result will be driven by expected policy. Nationalism grows when theta and z are high. This makes it more attractive to be a nationalist because parties cater policy more to them, and vice versa in the opposite case. So this is an illustration of proposition 6 in the paper, which shows two cases. In one case, the fitness of nationalism is positive. Then from whatever starting point you have in this domain, you just keep increasing the share of nationalists until it hits the upper bound, which is the sort of stable steady state. And if instead the fitness of nationalism is negative, you hit the opposite steady state with minimal nationalism. So expected immigration policy has dynamic consequences, but this baseline model has just one-way dynamics. So there's only a link from expected migration policy to nationalism. So the model predicts a correlation. We should see growing nationalisms go together with strict immigration control. But here, the nationalist share, the measure of nationalism, is an outcome. It's not a driver. However, all the three extensions that I mentioned with endogenous political organization alter the nature of these dynamics. And now you can get two-way dynamics with feedback from the nationalist share to immigration policy as mediated by political organization. And now this opens the door to multiple steady states and path dependence. So in the case of party composition, we have proposition 7, and let me just illustrate what that means. It means that we can get path dependence via nationalist party takeover. So imagine that there is a temporary shock that raises theta or z, or the two of them, so as to make the cosmopolitan parties cater to nationalists. They do that by a stricter immigration policy. And in order to do that, they have to run the share of nationalist candidates. But then, by luck, sooner or later, one party will be taken over by a nationalist leader. Once that nationalist leader is in place, she will set the maximally strict policy, x equal to 0. The other cosmopolitan-led party, it turns out, because reaction curves slope upwards, will fight harder now for the nationalist voters with a stricter immigration policy. This raises the risk of takeover, and by chance, it happens sooner or later. And by then, the fitness of nationalism has permanently shifted to be positive, even if the initial shock goes away. So I leave it to you to judge whether these first stages of this scenario is helpful in understanding what's going on with the Tories in the UK and the Republicans in the US. Now, in the group formation case, national fitness shifts when a group forms. And this is because the fitness now will take as its argument not the individually held salience of immigration, but the collectively held immigration. And that shifts up by revealed preference once the group has formed. So now we get the dynamic complementarity and the two-way dynamic. So crossing the threshold, when the group forms, nationalism becomes self-enforcing. Why is that? Well, effective salience will grow in the nationalist share. The fitness of nationalism will grow in effective salience, and the share of nationalists will grow in the fitness of nationalism. So while this is going on, nationalism feeds back to immigration policy because X is a decreasing function of uppercase theta. So now we have the possibility of divergent dynamics and multiple steady states that can occur but need not occur. Proposition 8 in the paper details that. So I've shown here in this graph an example where we do get two steady states. The blue curves here show the situation when the formation of the nationalist group at mu hat shifts fitness of nationalism from a negative number to a positive number. And clearly in this case, which steady state you go to will depend on the starting point. Starting here, you will go to the maximally nationalist steady state. Starting here, you'll go to the minimal nationalist steady state. And the possibility of path dependence can also be illustrated. Suppose you are in this branch and a temporary shock shifts up the fitness of nationalism to a positive number. So you go up here and you start adjusting in this direction. If you hit the threshold, you reach this dynamic, and this will take you to the nationalist steady state when this temporary shock has subsided. If you don't manage to do that, then you go back here. Now, party entry will have a similar consequence. It creates the same kind of dynamic complementarity. I don't have time to deal with it here, but it gives similar results to the one I've shown you for group formation. So putting the pieces together, the long run consequences of shocks, we can now think about them. What I've tried to argue is that even a temporary shock to one of these parameters, theta or z, can trigger organizational change that mediates a permanent change in nationalism and immigration policy. That path dependence is more likely to reflect a takeover of existing parties under plurality rule, but it's more likely to reflect the entry of the new nationalist party under PR. And this follows from the propositions that we derive in the paper. So finishing, I've shown a baseline static model that portrays party competition in two dimensions, a class-based conflict and an identity-based conflict based on nationalist cosmopolitan identities. I've shown how fundamentals drive the party incentives and whether nationalism shows up in policy or not. I've also entertained two sets of extensions, three forms of endogenous political organization, which arguably capture real-world phenomena, And what they also do is that they create the link from nationalist attitudes to immigration policy. And then I've very quickly and superficially introduced you to the dynamics of nationalism and shown that it opens the door to path dependence, where temporary shocks can affect long-run nationalist attitudes and immigration policy. Okay, I probably overstepped my time as a chairman, but here we are. So we have 5 minutes for questions.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but Fausto, Nicola have raised their hand, and I would like to ask a question too.
Okay, why don't you ask the question then?
Okay, go ahead.
So, two questions, a quick comment. So there is a book by John Huber. I don't know whether you have seen it, that touches upon these issues. So one long question is, how would that story differ? The second is, can this model be adapted to explain the same phenomena in the 70s and 80s, where maybe the organizations that emerged and the party leaders that emerged were catering towards class conflict rather than nationalism? In a different setup, of course, but the same mechanism. Could they speak to those times?
Potentially, I guess it's once you have 3 parameters, you can adapt them, but that's a poor answer. We would have to measure those perhaps via attitudes in the data, such as those Stephanie has talked about. Most surveys don't go back that far, but that would be one route to go. Yes, we know about the Huber project, and we should relate what we do to him more clearly. I think this kind of second dimension is in politics. It pops up from time to time in various national contexts. Like Belgium always had an ethnic or linguistic source of conflict together at the same time as they had their class-based conflict. The Greens emerged for a while, and it looked like a new dimension in politics, maybe with Greta Thunberg and the social movements that are organized around her. We will see an increase of that conflict. So in general, I think this way of thinking about 2 simultaneous political cleavages is an interesting one. Of course, it goes back to Rockham and cross-cutting cleavages and all of that, but most of the standard models that we use in political economics don't really consider the 2 at the same time, and I think it's plausible and interesting to do so. Yes, Nicola.
Again, it's very inspiring, the story, and probably one way to see what happens, so on and so forth. I wonder then, in part by looking at the past, coming from Guido's question, but also looking at the future, in the sense that here the active. You can hear?
Hold up your mic. That's
okay. You cannot. So what is going? The future is what is going to happen? Is really going to happen according to the model. The bottom line is, what actions other groups can take to contrast this? Because the salience seems to be, but probably it is true. In the sense that the salience is only one way. It's only for nationalists, not for normal people, even if they care very much about immigration and they really start disliking very much this extreme policy anti-immigration, they don't feel it enough to set up a contrasting organization, a contrasting group. I don't know.
No, you're right. I mean, what is missing here are the political or social entrepreneurs that go out and create these groups, and leaders, political leaders, or leaders of these social groupings in general. Some of them are quite spontaneous, but some of them, have a very clear leadership with an agenda of influencing things in the long run. I think that, as I said in the introduction, the $10,000 question is whether there is somehow inertia in the political system, so that an adjustment to about like the Brexit hype in the UK or the Trump hype in the United States, leaves a legacy on the political system for some time to come, and whether that happens through the reorganization of existing political parties or via new actors that enter the scene, that's obviously very hard to judge, but we need to use theory to form some hypotheses.